What is going on, everyone? Welcome to Coffee Table Talks, or as the Congressman put it a couple minutes ago, the Conference Table Talks, given where we're at today. But I want to just go ahead and skip to right who I have across the table here with me. I'll let him introduce himself, the good Congressman, Congressman Loudermilk. Go right ahead.
Well, it's good to be with you. Thanks for taking time to come to my office. It's so busy when we're back home in the district, but I've been looking forward to this for quite some time.
Congressman, I think busy is putting it lightly. Come on, you're too easy on yourself, man. You have had back-to-back meetings all day today.
Yep.
All day.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's one of those meetings that I love being with people, and so I tend to get off schedule because we're having a good conversation, and we got a 30-minute block going, and thus I run over a little bit, and I think you experienced that as well. And so it's times you just got to catch back up again.
Well, Congressman, there's an aspect about that actually I'm very happy that you said that, right? You enjoy talking to people.
Yes.
Okay. I normally don't do this with my podcast. Usually with my podcast, I like to keep things free form. I like to keep them open to whatever kind of conversation is going to happen because I think that's where people learn a lot. That being said, you, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, I want to particularly dive in on a subject, and that subject is service. Okay, because when I look at how you've done things and where you've been and what you've gone through, you embody service. And I want to kind of unpack that a little bit because this isn't just a conversation with a congressman about policy, about, things that you're saying yes or no to. I want to understand the individual behind all of that and why you tend to think that way when you approach policy. So if you don't mind me asking, okay, first question, we'll keep it simple. What were you like as a kid? Were you rambunctious?
I was to an extent. I was very shy, though. I was kind of raised an only child. And I say kind of because my brother and sister are 15, 16 years older than I am. And so I was a latecomer. While most in my generation, their grandfathers were veterans of World War II, my father was a veteran of World War II. He was a medic he was in the European theater, was in on D-Day landing, and served all the way through the Battle of the Bulge and on into Germany. And so I was fortunate that here I was as a young child. My dad fought in World War II, where most of my friends, it was their grandfathers that they served. But because my brother and sister were so much older than I was, my brother was in Vietnam by the time I was 5 years old. And so I was pretty much raised an only child, but I learned to be self-sufficient. And this is one of the things that, as I've gotten older and getting married, one of those things that you learn over time is to be a little more open, like with your spouse. But I could entertain myself. And that's one thing my wife would say is, he's perfectly happy if he just goes outside and works outside all day long. And I could go out in my wood shop and be out there in the wood shop all day long and perfectly fine with it. I don't have to have interaction, but I love the interaction as well. And so as a child, I was a little bit reserved because I was a little bit shy, but I also felt, a little abnormal, I guess you might say. I didn't fit in very well with a lot of folks. And it took me a while to actually, I didn't trust a lot of people. And so I had a smaller group of friends because it took me a while to actually learn who I could trust and who not to trust. And so I think it's a lot of things of just not having the mentorship of an older brother or older sister. And also with my parents being older, both of them worked. And so I was walking to and from school by myself, by the time I was in third or fourth grade. And it was a couple miles to my school. And I decided not to take the bus because I was around too many people then. And I enjoyed the walking and being alone. And so it was kind of self-sufficient, I guess you may say.
Fascinating. Did you have to walk uphill both ways in the snow by chance?
Well, that was what my father did. That's no, but I think it's the idea of that or the visualization of that is probably what my grandkids see when I talk about walking to and from school. It was a different time, though. My parents weren't afraid for me to walk back and forth, even though We lived in an apartment complex, which was unusual back in the early 70s. It was kind of rough in that area. Nothing like you would consider today, but I spent a lot of my childhood just kind of taking care of myself. Of course, my parents would come home in the evenings and make sure I had something to eat, and it was a very loving home. But I was kind of a loner, you may say.
Well, here's a fascinating thing, Congressman, because I can relate to you. My father, right, he was a landscaper, still is. He still is. He's a landscaper to this day, now owns his own business. But back in the day, when I was young, right, he was a landscaper by day. He would come home for dinner, and then by night, he would go street clean, right? He'd be one of those street cleaners. And then he'd come home, sleep for like 4 hours, and then wake up and start landscaping again, right? My mom worked 2 jobs in a hospital, or it's something of that nature. I remember it being medical. I don't quite remember whether it was a hospital or whether it was just a medical facility. Down in Albany, Georgia, we have all those Phoebe Putney kind of stuff down there. But quite, though, you talk about self-sufficiency. I had the opportunity to have an older sister. She was 5 years older than me, so she was practically my mom. She took good care of me, right? And we survived, through each other, right, and each other's company and all of that fun stuff. But I find it fascinating because I've had a moment in life now where through multiple deployment situations in the Marine Corps where I was able to what I call sit and think.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And I find it particularly interesting. You were able to do that at an early point in your childhood. So you actually probably had a lot of really interesting thoughts. And given that your father was part of, the World War II, right? And your brother being a part of Vietnam, you probably thought about a good many things. You were probably, that's actually really interesting. So does service particularly come from the exterior influence? Maybe from your brother going to Vietnam and your father being a part of World War II. Do you want to unpack that a little bit?
It had a huge influence on my life. Now, I don't want to paint the picture that I was abandoned as a child, but I really wasn't. My dad was in construction, and so back then, there was no such thing as a child labor law, right? So if you went and worked on the site with your parents. So my weekends, a lot of times on Saturday, when I was old enough to be on a job site, which was probably by the time I was 6 or 7, to pick up scrap lumber, I was out building houses and working in the construction industry, helping my dad. So we had a lot of interaction time at that point. And that's when I started hearing more and more about World War II. He didn't talk a lot about his own experiences. If you can imagine being a medic during the D-Day invasion or the Battle of the Bulge, there's probably not a lot that you're real comfortable talking about. But he loved telling stories of other people and of the war itself. So I grew up in a very Christian conservative, patriotic home. My brother, he was a hero of mine when I was young. He was over in Vietnam. And I used to, I remember he was actually in the Coast Guard, but was deployed to Vietnam, and they were running down Vietnamese vessels that were running arms. And I remember just being extremely proud of him, and I would find he had this old denim jacket that had patches on it, and I used to put that on and pretend I was my brother. So, yeah, they had a great amount of influence on my life as far as service goes because from the youngest days, I mean, my friends and I, most of what we would go out and play Army. We would do missions out in the woods. This was back when I wasn't working with my dad. You left the house, especially during summer break. Now, from school back then, you got out of school sometime in the beginning of May, and you didn't go back till September. So you had this entire summer off. And a lot of the times, my parents would leave to go to work in the morning. I never wore a pair of shoes. I was out all summer running around in the woods, playing in creeks, and quite often playing soldier. And it's definitely a tremendous amount of influence on service. And it was actually my father, words that he told me, that catapulted me in the political realm.
No kidding. Yeah. Well, I love this because it paints a caricature, right? To me, it shows a kid who is a fairly adventurous kid, a kid who's surrounded by, some fairly American-loving individuals and family. a family, which is really important, but a family that cares so much that they want to make sure that they have the income that comes in, that they're able to, support the family, which is huge. Yes. That's huge. That's a big foundation, right? Yeah. But that translates, because I feel like individuals like yourself, Congressman, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm almost interested to see, did you ever have thoughts of wanting to give back to your family for doing that, for you? Having your brother, he went out and served for you. Your father, he was in World War II, he served for you. Your father worked 2 jobs, he brought in income so that your family could live. And did those thoughts of giving back to your family eventually lead you to joining the Army?
It's actually Air Force.
Air Force.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. My dad was Army. My youngest son was airborne. But yeah, I went Air Force. And the answer to that question is yes. And one thing about having thinking time, I think it promotes a lot of creativity, because we didn't have the distractions then that we have now. You don't have cell phones. We didn't have CD players. I mean, the VCR wasn't existent. If it was, my family couldn't afford it. I mean, the only entertainment that we would have other than self-entertainment was what would come over broadcast television. And Ted Turner created a UHF channel. All the other ones were VHF, but he created a UHF channel that would play Batman or Gilligan's Island or those types of things, which only came on at certain times, right? So, but most of our time as children, especially the kids in the neighborhood, we would create things to do. And as you said, a lot of thinking time. And so I think that creates the creativity. It also creates the desire to follow in the footsteps of your predecessors. One thing my dad told me that was a huge influence on my life is what really catapulted me into the service as they did, to be able to return what was given for me. He said, son, if there's something in life you don't like, you have 2 choices. You can do something to change the situation, or accept the status quo and go on with your life. But complaining never accomplishes anything. He said, if you don't like something, change it. If you're not willing to change it, accept it and go on. And that really resonated with me. And that was really what catapulted me to join the Air Force. Now, I really wanted to go in the Army. I wanted the gung-ho experience, but I was already married by that time. I married young. My wife and I, what got me to that point was I had this desire to serve. I was driving home from work. I was working construction at the time, and I heard about the bombing of the Marine barracks in Lebanon, and it made me angry. I was living in Texas at the time. My parents were living in Alaska, where I had moved. We had moved after I graduated high school to work construction again. But I had got married, moved down to Texas, was working construction there. So I called my dad that evening, and we were talking about it. And I was telling him how angry I was about the cowards that bombed our U.S. Marines and killed so many of them. And he said, so what are you going to do about it? And I'm thinking, I mean, this is across the world. And that's all he said. So what are you going to do about it? And I determined right then, I need to return the service for them. And I went home and I told my wife what I was thinking and feeling. She said, well, let's go visit recruiters together. So that kind of limited a little bit of what I was looking at. I couldn't look at Navy, I couldn't look at Coast Guard, because I'm looking at long deployments, and I had a commitment that I had made to my wife at that time. And so we ended up looking at the Air Force was probably the right service for me at that time. There was a lot I could do. I was still gung-ho. There's some combat stuff that you can do. And so when I say that we joined the Air Force, I mean, as my wife, my spouse, she joined with me and was fully supportive. And but yeah, that was a long answer to your question of, yeah, it was their service that gave me that internal spirit that when I saw there is something I can do. I may not be able to fix what just happened in Lebanon, but I can step in and fill the shoes of those that just lost their life for our country.
You know, Congressman, without even knowing it, you're bringing up a very interesting point, and this has to do with youth nowadays. Okay, let's take your experience. Your father told you, it's like, what are you going to particularly do about it, right? And your reaction was actionable, right? There's tangible action to what you chose to do and then how it set your life on a certain course. Nowadays, and I could go into a entirely deep talk about this that would take us into a totally different tangent. I'm not going to. Nowadays, kids are kind of led to react. Not so much action, right, but reaction, right? So like I saw a comic the other day, fairly funny on Facebook. Like Facebook gets inundated with political comments because I have a lot of political people on my Facebook. So one of the comics that I saw was this young teenager passes by this homeless man and he's sleeping on the ground. It's just a horrible situation. She's like, you know what? I am going to do something about this. I am going to change. I'm going to change this reality because it's horrible. And she goes to a coffee shop like Starbucks or something and then tweets about it.
Yeah.
That was her reaction.
Right.
It wasn't her action. It wasn't to go to like a soup kitchen or something like that. And I do think nowadays in the world of cameras and podcasts and look at me, we've lost perhaps maybe this action-oriented thought process. So much as it's not so much the idea that I'm going to go to a soup kitchen or I'm going to go donate some clothes, blankets, et cetera, as much as I'm going to tweet about this and I'm going to feel good about myself because I made awareness of it.
Let's bring that to where we are today. She very well could have said, I'm going to call my congressman and tell him to fix the situation. And that's kind of where we are. Another thing that I learned from my dad is the history of our nation, that we were built as a government of the people, and the government has limited powers. That's our Constitution. My role in Congress is not to fix all the ills in our nation, is to preserve the rights of the people who can. Right? And so even in some of the Republican spheres, we look at what can we do to empower government to fix problems, and government usually creates problems, does not fix problems. And so I'm sharing with a lot of people, look, we need to resist the temptation to further empower government to force change that we may like. Because the more that you empower government, the more you reduce liberties of individuals. And so I think that was a good point that you made is, well, let me go tweet something. I feel good about myself. But what has that done to help that individual? Don't look for somebody else to do what you can do. And I'm meeting with people here today that what they're interested in is getting government off their back so they can fix problems. And that's what we need. What we have problem in America is a cultural problem. It's not a government problem. Boy, we've got more government than we've ever had in the history of our nation, and things are not any better. In fact, they're in some cases worse than they've ever been. So what is it that you can do to make culture better? Because whatever you decide to do, you're going to be more effective than the government ever will be.
Quite. What is it? I subscribe to the idea that politics is downstream from culture.
Exactly.
You control culture, you control politics. Arguably, that actually, funny enough, I learned that lesson from a Marxist that I read, Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci? Is that how you see? An Italian Marxist. Really weird. But he quite literally observed the fact that revolution, physical revolution, was not working. It wasn't winning the people over. Right? He determined then, as he wrote on the back of napkins in an Italian prison, that it was through culture, that it was through incremental progression through the system, was how he was going to change people.
James Garfield, President of the United States, one of my favorite quotes by him was that if Congress is reckless, ignorant, and corrupt, it's because the people accept recklessness, ignorance, and corruption. What he was saying is politics is downstream of culture. If there's things in government you don't like, government will not correct itself. It's up to the people to correct it. And the way that the people can correct it is not rely on the government to fix the problems of culture. Some things I've been through personally have really verified that in my life. You may remember I was on a baseball field when an assassin came on with a hit list of Republicans that he was going to kill and started shooting over 100 rounds onto the field. I had well over 20 rounds shot at me, going right by my head, hitting shit next to me as I was trying to get to one of my colleagues who had been shot in the back, came out of his chest. I'm trying to get, as one of the staff members, trying to get to him through this 8-minute gun battle. Never once did I think, wait till I get back to the Capitol, I'm going to pass a law. I never thought that. Because the guy that walked on the field, he had no respect for law, right? He was already violating dozens of federal and state laws. In some states, he could be executed for what he was trying to do. If he would have successfully killed somebody, he could have been executed for that. He was willing to take that risk. So if he had no respect for law, how would another gun law have changed that situation? It wouldn't have. Not at all. So again, when I finally got back to the Capitol, all my colleagues are up before the cameras saying, this is why we need more gun laws. And I'm like, this is not going to help anything. We have a cultural crisis to where we have no respect for authority, we have no respect for law, and we have no respect for life. That is nothing that Washington can fix. This is a cultural crisis that we have in this nation. The cultural warriors are the people that are on the front line every day in the churches, in the synagogues, working hand in hand with other people. That's where the influence is. And we have to make this cultural change if we're going to change America.
Now, here's a fascinating thing. And this is why I love this type of media, right? This isn't just like I'm a conservative individual, I'm going to sit down in front of a camera and talk about conservative policies and et cetera, because we're all going to agree on that. My conservative watchers are going to agree on everything that we're going to say about this. What this does, this conversation that we're having, right? One, we talked about your childhood a little bit. You are a human being, Congressman. Right, you're not some intangible thing that nobody can touch, right? You grew up as a child. You had parents. You had this. You had that, right? You had things that instilled in you certain values, ethics, morals, et cetera, et cetera. You had a fellow human being, not politically divided, human being with potentially a sucking chest wound, right? You know, sitting right next to you, in a very real manner. You know, life was on the line, and thus. Things as time has gone on in your life, you know, leading up to that point has had you think certain ways about approaching policies. The human being, Congressman, are not the enemy. And that's the thing that I'm trying to reach out to people on both sides for that matter. I'm so tired of hearing individuals just talk nasty, man. Right. You know, I had individuals I disagreed with in the Marine Corps, and, you know, reconnaissance is a fairly small group. Right. We're like a family. But
like Congress, all type A personalities, right?
Exactly, man. Butting heads is just going to happen, right?
And everybody's absolutely right.
Yeah, in their own little ways, So what I'm seeing in youth in particular is not a want to resolute conflict as much as it is, I am right, my ways are right, you need to follow me. You often hear, and I do the same thing, right? You know, I'll say, like, guys, we need to unify desperately. I think everybody's really saying that because they're seeing all this stuff happen in our country. But a lot of times what folks don't realize is they're saying you need to unify under me, my thoughts, you know. I think we've lost track of what unity is. And that's why I wanted to dissect your idea of service, because it transcends these little things that we get on to each other about. The idea of service is an idea of total, right? It's sacrificing your time with your wife to be in service, right? It's taking aspects of your brother who is in Vietnam, your father who was in World War II, and wanting to repay them for the debt that they paid, right? And you know, doing things in that nature. It's going back and opening up your own business in Georgia. Right? And then going into state and then going into federal. It's a whole journey. And I kind of want to touch on that. Now, you went into the Air Force, right? Now, post-Air Force, this is something that I don't really know too much about. Now, from what I understand, you opened up a business, right? Can you talk a little bit about that business?
Yeah, it was an IT services business. Now, when I was in the Air Force, I was catapulted in the intelligence arena because at the time, I was able to get a top secret security clearance and ended up getting an SCI clearance after that. Those in the military know what that is. That's, only in intelligence and nuclear weapons do you get the SCI clearance. And so that put me in a unique position. And it was on the front end of a technology revolution. This was in 1984, 1985. This new technology of Ethernet was out. The Air Force wanted, and the military in general, I worked Joint Force most of the time, wanted to adopt this newer, faster technology for command and control and intelligence. Well, after Desert Storm, there was a reduction in force program, and so I was offered a job with a defense contractor, as the Air Force was actually rolling people out, and they were moving some of the operations to contractors. So I was hired by a defense contractor basically to go back and do what I was already doing. And so after doing that for a few years, I started looking at private sector and taking what I learned and helping businesses implement this new networking computer technology. And so my brother-in-law, who happened, he was Air Force, he was working at the NSA in technology as well. We pulled our knowledge and moved back to Georgia, where I was originally from, and we started this IT services business and continued it for 20 years until I ran for Congress, which you're not allowed to have a independent business. So I had to relinquish that business to go to Congress. But, it was, and there were so many lessons you learned in that too, because we built a business from scratch, which means that there were times we were trying to figure out how to make payroll at the end of the week. And one thing about service is not about yourself. And this is one thing I've been to colleges who've asked me to come and speak about entrepreneurship, starting your own business. And I've had some that invited me to come back again and others that didn't, because I would go in and say, if your idea of entrepreneurship is working a 9-to-5 job and having people do all the work for you, you're in the wrong field. You're the first one in the office, you're the last one to leave, and you're the last one to get paid. You're the last one to take any time off. You can get to that, but it takes a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get to it. You're taking huge risk. I was putting everything I had ever saved which wasn't that much, on the line to start a business, to fill a niche that we saw that was an opportunity. And but that's why I see that even when you're running your own business, you have to have a servant's spirit about yourself if you're really going to succeed. And succeed doesn't always mean financial success. And that's another thing that I think is an issue with a lot of people today, is the definition of success. It's not always monetary. I know a lot of people that have made a lot of money and they're as miserable as they can be. To me, it was accomplishing something. This is one thing that you don't get in Congress, is a sense of accomplishment, because it takes so long to get anything done, and the end product usually doesn't even look like what you started with. And so you learn to supplement that. I do woodworking. I love working in the yard. You give me a chainsaw and put me out in the field, I'll be having a time of my life, because I can actually accomplish something there. But it also gives you that time to think. And so that's the lessons of life are in everything that you're doing, and especially if you're putting it with that servant attitude, is how will what I'm doing right now help somebody else?
Quite. It's much more, and I've observed my father in this, right? I got taught these things in the Marine Corps, right? But, I got taught first by my father. Every employee that he ever hired, I mean, we're talking landscaping, man. It's not attracting like the end-all, be-all type of folks, But every employee that he hired, I mean, he always went out of his way to help them out. Always. And sometimes actually it came back to bite him. Yeah.
That was what my dad was.
And it was what it was. He felt like, oftentimes they're kids, right? And they come from kids. South Georgia's not, the greatest place ever. Right. You have a lot of low income, et cetera, and these come from single. Gnats, man. I'll tell you what, that's something I love about being above Columbus and the gnat line, man. It's great. It's great. The summers, people complain about summers. Summers was gnats, so much worse. Yeah. But the fascinating thing is, these kids, once they're exposed to genuine service, genuine care, for that matter, like care. I care for you, not only you, but for your future, right? They latch on to it. They do, man. They latch on to it. And I think that's something that we're kind of devoid of.
It is. Probably one of the most impactful statements, and and unfortunately this is politically incorrect to talk about these days. But in your military, you do a lot of training. And I was in a non-commissioned officers training course that we had. And you always have a buddy. Everything you do is with a training buddy. And mine was a young black guy. And we were good friends. We worked in the same area together. And we were in a session that was talking about the Airman's Creed. It's the same thing. It's that you're willing to give your life for your country. And there's a soldier's creed and a Marine creed. It's pretty much all the same thing. And it's the rules of combat is if you're captured, you will not give up any information. You're willing to give your life for your country, et cetera, et cetera. And he was going through what that really meant. And I remember he was a senior master sergeant, one of the fittest guys I've ever seen, a black guy that was just, he was huge. And you're just sitting there saying, okay, I got respect for this guy. He's been through it. He was a Vietnam veteran. And if I remember, he was pararescue. And so he looked at the guy sitting next to me and he said, do you know what this really means? He said, what? He said that when you took your oath of office, you're saying you're willing to give your life for this country. That means for the rights of the people sitting around you and the rights of the people who don't even know you. He said, yeah, I think so. He said, do you really know? He said, what do you mean? He said, what this means is you're willing to give your life so that the Ku Klux Klan can hate you. Oh, that blew me away. I'm sitting there thinking, oh man, that is profound. And you could see it on his face. And I started thinking about it. And I'm like, is that really what this means? You're willing to give your life to somebody that hates you, that they will have the freedom to hate? Look, hate is wrong. I grew up in a very Christian household. You don't hate, you love. You don't have to agree, but at the same time, is that really what service means? And that takes a lot of thought. Back then it was profound. It's very profound today, right? But what he's getting across is when you're in service, you're not just giving up something for a select few people that you agree with. You're giving up for freedom. That also means the freedom to change the hearts and minds of other people. And so that's a tough lesson. And when you're, in your early 20s and you're serving in the military and you're thinking it's still in the Cold War, that we're, in this Cold War with Russia, and I was stationed in Alaska at the time, and we were intercepting Soviet bombers that were trying to get in Alaskan airspace every day. And, we're on the verge of potential World War III. You really have to put a lot of thought into that. What am I really willing to sacrifice things for?
It's the encompassing idea of it all, right? It is. It truly is. Saying stuff like that, it's the zingers, right? It's the zingers that wake people up and realize, wow, I'm doing this for something. Again, transcending. We're transcending the physical, limitations. These physical limitations of me despising you because of X reason. But you're part of the whole. You're part of the conglomerate. Yeah. And because of that, I am here to protect you. I'm here to do the things.
This kind of goes back to what we were talking about is, I'm right. I want to do these things and I want us to unify, but it's my idea that matters. And when in reality, if you're fighting for freedom, it means you're going to fight for the freedom of other people to disagree with you. But he put it in such a profound way that you could have heard a pin drop in that entire room because we all knew how bad that organization was. But you start putting things in perspective, then you're like, okay, maybe I don't have all the answers. Maybe I do need to open up to somebody else. But unification is about compromise. I've always told people, I'll negotiate my preferences, but I won't compromise my principles. That means you have to know what your principles are. And that's an issue I think we have in our country today. People don't know what their principles are. Preferences are those things that I prefer, those things I like. Principles are those things that I cannot do without. Those are things I'm willing to die on the hill for. So my dad used to tell me, he said, it's important to know what you believe. It's more important to know why you believe what you believe. Because if you can explain why you believe something, then you can defend it. And I've seen that. That is more important than politics, than anything else. And so I would literally sit down and write down, what are these principles? Which are these things politically that, no, there's no compromise on? That, no, this is, those things that are in our Constitution, those things that I believe are inherent rights that we have to protect of individuals. Then there's things that, well, I prefer lower taxes. But yet the Constitution allows Congress to, create taxes. Now, I believe we're taxed too much. We have a spending problem, not a revenue problem. But putting it in perspective, well, we can change the way that we tax things. And so there's things you have to separate. What are preferences? What are principles? And the principles are those things you don't compromise on. But the majority of what we draw a line in the sand on sometimes are preferences. And somebody else may have a better idea.
Congressman, you have absolutely no idea how tempting it is to carry on this conversation for another, 3 hours maybe. But alas, we have reached the end. I tell you what, I've learned an immense amount. And I feel like we've only broached, I wanted the theme to be service, but service is difficult. It's difficult to hone in on because it involves so many different aspects. And it leaves open, I think, for a potential conversation, for the future maybe. So, hey, who knows? Yeah. Maybe you'll come on again and we might be able to continue. Congressman, like I said, I've learned a lot from you. You probably didn't learn too much from me, but I hope I gave you good conversation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, bottom line is there's two things that are intrinsically tied together, service and sacrifice. You can't have one without the other. And that sacrifice is not what others can give up for you, it's what you can give up for others. This isn't the worst job I've ever had, in some senses. I've never, even when I was in the military, I never got shot at as much as I've been shot at, run over, falsely accused. Hated by people out there simply because of things I stand for, and some things that people just make up about you, right? My family gives up a lot because we're under criticism. A lot of times, there's been times when in 1 week I got 200 death threats. And this is not something that I want to do because of the perks. It's something I believe I've been called to do. And there's definitely sacrifices involved with it. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Congress, you're in the military, you're working in a church or in a civic organization, or you're even on your job. There's going to be sacrifice when you put others ahead of yourself. As a Christian, that's what we're taught, is it's others first, myself second.
I love it. Well, Congressman, cheers. All right. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the ego on the cup there.
I do. Yeah, this is awesome.
You put as much coffee in that cup as you want over time.
Well, unfortunately, I will probably be putting a lot. I probably drink too much of it. But, you got to keep the caffeine flowing.
I love it. Well, till next time, Congressman, have a good one.